Thank you so much. It's an enormous honor to be giving the lecture at the launch of the network as a university-wide one, partly because it's just such a remarkable thing that this is a university where you can say, hey, there are problems outside the STEM subjects, let's do something about them. And the university's response is, yes, let's do something about them. So it's not just this network, but also the WARP program being extended outside the STEM subjects. I think that this university is unusual in taking that so seriously, and I hope others will follow the example. But it's nice to be at a place that's leading the way on this. Okay, so background situation is what we're all aware of, that there are low numbers of women, everybody knows, in science, engineering, mathematics, but most people don't know, also in other fields. I'm a broken record on this topic. Philosophy, depending on which country you look at, it's low, no matter where it is. Sometimes it's 16%, sometimes it's 25% if you're doing really well, but it's low. And philosophy is not alone in being an exception. That's why my understanding is other fields like, say, economics and Russian are also very male-dominated. Even in fields that have a lot of women, there are low numbers of women at the top, and there are lots of barriers that women face. So why is it? Well, some people would like to say that it's due to innate, unchangeable differences, and we should all just learn to live with it. We can't completely rule out the possibility that there are some innate, unchangeable differences playing a role, but there are some good reasons to doubt that, and if you want to look those up, you can. People will say it's due to difficulty combining work and childcare, and that undoubtedly does play a role, but it's an insufficient explanation. It can't explain why some fields have high representations of women and some fields have low representations of women. It could be fully conscious, old-fashioned sexism, people going around saying that women are less smart than men. That does happen more often than it should. But it's not the full explanation, because fortunately, that's relatively rare. Could it be sexual harassment? Well, that undoubtedly does play a role. I'm very involved also in efforts to do something about that in philosophy. And you may want to have a look at the Chronicle of Higher Education over the next week or so. But what I want to talk about here is another kind of explanation, which has to do with unconscious, largely unconscious psychological phenomena that we're all prone to, that almost certainly is playing a role, and that is clearly bad and something that we should do something about, even if these other factors may also play a role. So I'm going to set aside the other things for now. I'll be talking about two broad phenomena, implicit bias and stereotype threat. What I'm going to mean when I'm talking about implicit biases here is unconscious biases that affect the way that we perceive and evaluate and interact with members of groups that are stigmatized in our societies. And stereotype threat is a phenomenon which is sometimes unconscious, sometimes conscious, in which people's awareness of their own group membership may cause them to underperform. And I'll explain both of these in a lot more detail. So first, implicit bias. I mean, obviously it's a bad thing if we're being unconsciously racist or sexist in some way. But it's important to know that this unconscious phenomenon, implicit bias, arises from a really valuable tendency that all human beings have, which is to make fast associations and fast inferences. I mean, if there's a fire, you don't want to stop and think, oh, fire, that's probably hot, so maybe I shouldn't touch it. Oh yeah, I should back away from it, right? You don't want to have to go through a conscious chain of reasoning. You want to instantly think fire, jump away. So these very fast associations and reactions are a really useful thing for us to have, and that's why our brains are so good at that. Unfortunately, it can have some bad effects when it comes to social groups. And psychologists over the last few decades have shown quite clearly that it has lots of bad effects. The best known experiments about this are ones that you can go check out yourself on the web. You can go participate in them. They're not the only ones by any means, but they're the best known. These are implicit association tests. If you go to Project Implicit, which is run by Harvard, you can take these tests. And they will be tests of the associations that you unconsciously hold with regard to various social groups. Be sure if you do that and you are a British person that you select the UK test so that they're not like giving you names of little-known American politicians and that sort of thing. So look for the right one for your country. What these tests consist of is asking you to very quickly pair faces or words with collections of adjectives. So like this face, you'd have to classify as African American or good, or European American or bad, and then those categories are flipped. So you get African American or bad, European American or good. And it turns out people are much quicker to categorize African American and bad together than to categorize African American and good together. And all the other predictable associations that you'd expect. And these are extremely widespread, these tendencies. They occur in people who are consciously, explicitly devoted to fighting prejudice. They occur in members of the targeted groups themselves. A nice example of this comes from Jesse Jackson's discussion of his own experience. This is Jesse Jackson, a very famous American civil rights leader. And he said one of the most painful experiences he's had is realizing that when he's walking alone in an unfamiliar city at night, he hears footsteps behind him. He turns around and he feels relieved when he sees that it's a white person. And so this is an instance in which his unconscious associations have risen up to the surface and he's realized that they're there. That's why it's such a disturbing experience. But this is a man who is black himself and has devoted himself to fighting prejudice against black men. He does not consciously think that black men are violent. He's devoting himself to fighting that stereotype, and yet it still affects him. So we're all affected by this, whether we like it or not. And this affects a lot of our behaviors. I'm going to be focusing on our behaviors in academia. And I want to mention, as is already apparent, this isn't just about gender. I'm supposed to be giving a talk on women in academia, but I do want to call attention to the fact that there are lots of different and overlapping stigmatized groups, and this affects all of them. So one place that we really see implicit bias in action, but less so in this country, is marking. Anonymous marking, which is widely practiced in this country, but not in the US and not in many European countries, leads to higher marks for women. The only good explanation you can give of that is that when you see that it's a woman, you're giving a lower mark, right? These studies, by the way, were done by someone from the University of Sheffield's psychology department. Another thing to be very pleased with. Implicit bias also manifests itself in letters of reference. So, women, letters of reference for women tend to include a lot of adjectives having to do with how friendly and helpful and hardworking they are, like, works hard, is friendly. They'll include more doubt raisers, like, she's surprisingly successful. And remarkably, they quite commonly include totally irrelevant things like, is good friends with my wife, or very attractive, or dresses really nicely. That doesn't happen in the references for men. The references for men use other kinds of adjectives, like brilliant, outstanding, and original. So, yeah, you can guess who's going to get the jobs. It manifests itself in teaching in other ways than just in marking. There are lots of studies showing that there's a tendency to call on male students more often than female students, even if they both have their hands up. There's a tendency to more charitably interpret the sorts of confused, inchoate comments that our students very occasionally make. And they get more charitably interpreted if they're coming from a man. You think that they're grappling towards something really original and interesting, and that's why it's so unclear, whereas with a woman, you're more likely to think they're just confused. Experience lots and lots and lots of women will report, and I imagine lots in this room have experienced it, not just in teaching, but in other circumstances. A point is made by a woman and sort of passed over and not really taken seriously, and then a man says exactly the same thing and it gets taken up. And women do all of this too. I'm going to emphasize this over and over again. This isn't just something the men do. We all do it. We all live in the same culture. We're all influenced by the same stuff. The studies, there are a lot of beautiful studies of gender and race and religion and other social categories on hiring. And these consist of taking exactly the same CV and sending it off with a different name at the top of it. And it turns out that John is a lot more attractive as a job prospect than Jane is. You'd offer him more money, you give him a higher rank, you're more likely to call him for an interview. John is also a much more attractive job prospect than Yasser. Interestingly, parenthood differently affects men and women when you're evaluating their CVs. So again, you take exactly the same CV and add on to it an indication of parenthood, like president of the Parent-Teacher Association. This is an additional accomplishment, an additional leadership role, and it sends the woman's CV to the bottom of the pile, it sends the man's CV to the top of the pile. So there's bias in favor of fathers and against mothers. Now, as with all of this stuff, people like to think maybe this is dying out. Maybe it's just because there's a lot of really old people in positions of power and the younger people aren't going to be like this. But unfortunately, there was a study just last year in which they found exactly this effect for gender. They found it was equally strong for men and women evaluating the CVs, and it was equally strong across all age groups. So it's not dying out. We've still got to fight this. Women and leadership. Women face special obstacles to being taken seriously as leaders that men don't face. So if you give people a picture like this and have a man at the head of the table, 100% of the time they'll say the man's the leader, if you ask them who's the leader of this group. If you have a woman at the head of the table, they'll signal her out as the leader only 50% of the time. So quite literally, women have more trouble being recognized as leaders. Even once they are recognized as leaders, they're not treated the same way that men are. So they've done studies where they take actors and train them to be in the leadership role in a situation. And they train them to say exactly the same things and do exactly the same things. And they're very good actors, so they can do that. The men are viewed as authoritative and good leaders and competent, and the women are viewed as strident and difficult and all those other adjectives you'd expect to be associated with women leaders. Even though they're doing, well, I was going to say the same things. It's not quite the same things, as it turns out. They tried really hard to do exactly the same things, but the women had to repeat themselves several times. So they weren't able to do exactly the same things. So I think it's quite clear from all this that implicit bias is resulting in injustice, which is something we shouldn't like. People are not receiving the marks that they should if they're not being marked anonymously. Hiring's not being based on merit. More generally, women's career progress is being impeded. This is all terrible stuff that we're doing. But are we to blame for it? I'm going to come back to this a bit more later, but I want to flag up right now that I think we're not to blame for this in the same way that we're to blame for thinking women are just stupider than men. I think for most of us, before we learn about this anyway, we don't have any idea this is going on. It's unconscious. In lots of cases, it's contrary to our genuine, deeply held, hard-fought egalitarian commitments, and we don't know what to do about it even when we find out it's there. So I think we're not to blame for it in the same way. Now, stereotype threat, although it's often run together with implicit bias, is quite different. This is something that happens to members of groups that are stigmatized as not very good at some particular task. And it's very much task-specific. And in instances of stereotype threat, members of those groups will underperform at those tasks if they're in a high-stakes situation, they care about doing well, and something reminds them of their group membership. This happens a lot. So women who are reminded of their group membership by, say, ticking a box indicating their gender, or, being in a room surrounded by pictures of men, will underperform in a high-stakes math test. I'm just glad there aren't any, stereotypes about women as public speakers. Black men will underperform at any test that they think of as a test of intellectual ability or academic ability. It's not just members of stigmatized groups that are subject to stereotype threat, and I think this is an interesting point worth emphasizing. I think by any measure, white American men at Ivy League universities are not an underprivileged group. And yet you can introduce stereotype threat in them by having them do something that you tell them is a test of athletic ability. Especially if you get them to think about how much better black people are at sports than they are. You remind them of this stereotype somehow. This starts really disturbingly early. 5 to 7-year-old girls will do better on a maths test if they color in a picture of a landscape before than if they color in a picture of a girl holding a baby doll. Because a landscape doesn't make them think about their gender, the girl holding a baby doll does. So it starts early and the effects are dramatic. The result is, again, injustice. Because with exactly the same ability, members of these groups will have a harder time performing well if they're being put in situations that induce stereotype threat. And this has negative effects for the society that they live in, because this is a lot of people not performing up to their full potential. So when you put these together, members of stigmatized groups have a harder time doing well, and even when they do well, they have a harder time being recognized as doing well. And what's really disturbing about this, well, I guess it's really disturbing already, but I think what's personally disturbing about this is that a lot of this is going to be the result of the unconscious biases of people of genuine egalitarian goodwill. So we're in a really bad moral position. All of us are very likely being influenced by biases that we find absolutely abhorrent and repugnant. We are almost certainly acting at some point, acting in ways that are based on values that we strongly reject, that have harmful effect on others and sometimes harmful effects on ourselves as well. These actions of ours help to perpetuate racism, sexism, and other injustices. And, well, this is obviously unfair and unjust. So we are all implicated in some deeply disturbing behavior that has deeply disturbing effects. I want to call attention to something else, though, because we're at a university, and the point of the university is to seek knowledge and seek truth. This is something that we all care very much about. And implicit bias in particular damages us in our efforts to understand the world, in our efforts to seek the truth and to seek knowledge. And I want to talk a little bit about how it damages us in that. I think the nicest way to see this is to think about how strongly this can affect us even when we're acting in areas of our expertise. There's a beautiful study of what's called prestige bias, in which the experimenters took papers that had previously been published in top psychology journals and they sent them off to be refereed by top psychology journals with false, unprestigious affiliations. Universities that nobody thinks of as very good at research. And what happened is that 90% of the papers were rejected. They were not rejected because, well, we already published that. Should be a good reason to reject it. Or because this is plagiarism, also a good reason to reject it. But for serious methodological errors, other than plagiarism. So the reason I think this is so disturbing is that these psychologists who found serious methodological errors in these papers that had previously been published in top journals, they're making mistakes, either one or the other group. I don't know which, whether it's the second referees or the first ones, probably both. Okay? They're making mistakes about something that they know really, really well, the methodology of their own field. These mistakes are based on something totally irrelevant. They're meant to be evaluating experimental design, not institutional affiliation. They would think it's wrong to be influenced by institutional affiliation. They're being influenced by stuff that they reject. It's wrong to be influenced by it. It's irrelevant. And they're doing all this without being aware of it at all. Now, I think this should be incredibly disturbing to all of us. You could respond by saying, yeah, but we know we're human. We all make mistakes. How should this change the way we think about ourselves? Oh, don't restart now. Okay. And that's already part of our self-conception, but I think this kind of mistake isn't part of our self-conception. The reason is that, we do know that we make mistakes sometimes if we're trying to do something that we're not very good at or not very experienced at. That's not what's happening here. We make mistakes if we're drunk, but presumably that's not what's happening here, at least not in all cases. Right? These are not the sorts of mistakes that we think of ourselves as making. And I think that one way of understanding just how unsettling this is to compare it to the traditional philosophical problem of skepticism. So this traditionally skeptical arguments ask us to think about some possibility that would undermine everything we know that we can't rule out. Like, so in the case of Descartes, maybe everything that I think is going on is really a dream. Or in the version that, we figure we can't rule that out, so maybe I don't know anything. Right? That's the way the arguments are meant to disturb us, at least. In a more recent version, the thought is maybe I'm just a brain in a vat, and somebody's stimulating me to think that there's all these people around and buildings and things, but actually I'm just a brain in a vat being stimulated. Now, I think implicit bias skepticism does something different from that. It doesn't just raise some possibility that we can't rule out, some possibility that I might be making some mistakes. It tells us that we're very likely to be making mistakes quite a lot of the time on stuff that we think we're good at finding out about. It's not just that we can't rule out this possibility, it's that we've got good reason to think it's true. So in that sense, I think it's stronger than traditional forms of skepticism. It's giving us reason to think this disturbing alternative possibility actually holds. Now, it's not as sweeping as traditional skepticism. It's not going to make me think maybe none of this exists. But it's not quite clear which things it'll cause me to call into doubt, which things it won't, because there are lots of times that I have accepted things on the basis of what someone has told me, and I might well have been affected by their social category in ways that I don't think I should be. And I find my colleague Chris Hookway's work on skepticism especially useful for thinking about this. He argues that skeptical arguments are best understood as challenges to the reliability of what he calls our cognitive instruments. And they're demands that we demonstrate that we're not being irresponsible in relying on the cognitive instruments that we have. It's okay to just go with what we've got. He thinks it's all right to respond to normal skepticism by saying, look, until you give me good reason to doubt my cognitive instruments, I'm just not going to worry about being a brain in the vat. You haven't given me any good reason to think that holds, so I'm going to go on relying on my cognitive instruments. And I think that is reasonably satisfying. But what implicit bias skepticism does is something quite different. It tells us that our cognitive instruments are faulty and can't be relied on. It tells us that we are going wrong about important things. We're dismissing things we shouldn't dismiss. We're believing things we shouldn't believe. And another way in which I think it's more troubling than traditional skepticism is that, look, suppose you actually are a brain in a vat. You'd probably do about as well as you can, right? I mean, what would you do differently if you found that out? Not really anything. Might as well just keep going. But when you find out that this is very likely true of you. You don't think, oh, well, I'm human. Right? You think, no, I need to stop, or at least you should think that. Right? This is going wrong in ways that we find incredibly politically worrying. We are perpetuating serious injustices in the world. So there's a demand for action. And I want to turn now to what kinds of actions we should and shouldn't take. I'll start with what not to do. One of the most common things to do that people try in response to this is, look, I don't have to worry about this because I always remind myself, don't be biased. I remind myself to be objective, ignore gender, ignore race. I don't see those things. It doesn't work. It backfires. It makes it worse. Incidentally, reflecting positively on your own objectivity makes it worse. Thinking about some past time when you managed to be unbiased, if you could somehow know that there was such a time, you might think, I want to think about that and do all that again because I got it right. Bad idea, it makes it worse. There's some stuff that's very common to do that only sort of works. Putting a woman on every hiring committee. It does not fix the problem. It's important to state that. One reason is that the woman is very likely to also be biased against women. Another reason is that because of the biases of the rest of the group, even if that woman managed to not be biased against women, she might have a hard time getting her views taken seriously. You need a certain critical mass, so one woman probably isn't going to be enough. However, putting a woman, or better, more than one woman, on a hiring committee will have certain good effects. If you have enough women on the committee, it can help to reduce stereotype threat, which could be triggered by being faced with an all-male room. It's less likely that sexual harassment will take place in the interview, so that's good. But there are some things that really do work, and I want to talk about those because I think it's important to know about them. There are lots of them. I'm only going to be able to talk about a few of them here. It's a wonderful, burgeoning research area. Okay, so obviously anonymizing is great because if you don't know someone's social group, you can't let your bias against that social group affect you. The great success story of anonymity is when orchestras started holding auditions behind curtains so that you couldn't see who was playing. This is actually a picture of my cousin Gail, who spent a decade unemployed, and then when the audition started taking place behind curtains, she got a job with the Chicago Symphony in her first audition. Now people will often say, yeah, anonymity is great, we can do that for marking, we can do that for journal refereeing maybe, but we can't do it for hiring because, we need to hire someone who can teach. We need to see them teach. And this is absolutely true. You can't do it for the whole process. But you can think about parts of the process to anonymize. Right? So at the stage where you're getting people to fill out their job application form online, you can make sure that the application forms come to you with a number rather than a name, so that the initial sifting of CVs is done anonymously. You need some help from the people who run the electronic system, obviously. Another thing that I've heard of in one philosophy department is that after they get their long list of candidates and they want to read, they have the whole department then read writing samples, they anonymize the writing samples that were sent to the whole department. And they made sure that they got written feedback from everyone at that stage on the anonymized writing samples, so that some part of the process was done anonymously. Another thing that's important to do there is to get the feedback at that stage, rather than after they've also met the person and can take into account the social group. So there may be parts of the process you can anonymize even if you can't anonymize the whole thing. Another thing that works is to spend some time thinking about a counter-stereotypical exemplar, like Gillian Garing, physics professor, whose portrait will soon be on these walls, I'm pleased to say. Thinking a counter-stereotypical exemplar is a member of the group, the stereotype group, who doesn't fit the group stereotype, so a woman physics professor. And if you do that just before entering a situation in which your biases might have bad effects, that can really help to reduce the influence of biases. And images are particularly effective for this. But so that we don't all have to carry pictures of Jillian around in our wallets, it's also a good idea to just get more of those counter-stereotypical exemplars around, which of course we're all committed to doing. But in addition to trying to hire them and get them as students, get them around, invite them to speak at your seminar series, invite them to speak at your conferences, put them in your edited volumes, cite them in your papers, make sure that people are aware of their existence on a regular basis. This reduces the influence of the biases that people already have, but also helps to change the regularities in the world that underpin the biases, because if you have a lot more women physics professors around, the stereotype that women aren't so good at physics is going to die out. Now, the response to this that you'll hear is, but that means basing our judgments on something other than merit. That means when I'm organizing my conference, I shouldn't just think to myself, who is the best? Well, the fact is your judgment was already based on something other than merit. That's what the research on implicit bias tells us. We're influenced by social group all the time, even when we're trying to just think, who's the best? The only way that we're going to be able to make judgments based on merit is if we actually break down these stereotypes and break down their influence on us. So until we get to that point, we need to think about social group membership. We need to think about it consciously rather than just letting its unconscious influence have free ride. What else works? Food, strangely. If you are tired, hungry, rushed, your unconscious biases are more likely to affect you in damaging ways. In fact, it's been found that sugar is especially useful. So, one good thing to do is make sure that every hiring committee, are you listening? Every hiring committee has a tray like that. Okay. Other things that are important to do, agree on your criteria in advance. If you don't do that, it's been found that people will shift, so that suppose you have a man who's got more experience and a woman who's got more credentials, then the judgment will be made that the experience is more important. And then you look at the case where the woman's got more experience and the man has more credentials, then the judgment is made that the credentials are more important, and the committee doesn't even realize they're shifting in this way. So agree on your criteria in advance, agree on their relative importance, and stick to it. Don't put too much weight on just one thing. I know in philosophy it's very common to place enormous weight on the job talk, which happens at the end of the process for just the shortlisted candidates. In most cases, it's, if there's a woman candidate, she's presenting a talk to a room that's overwhelmingly men, shooting objections at her for an hour. And this is a very much stereotype threat-inducing environment. There's little way to do something about that if your department really is almost all male. But what you can do is reduce its influence by getting feedback on the other elements of the process as you go, so that you're not just putting too much weight on one thing that happens at the end. Because, of course, the published papers matter too. Another thing that works, it's not pleasant, but it's helpful, is before you go into a situation where you're worried about your biases affecting you, spend some time thinking about instances in the past when you were biased. This seems to help to activate unconscious processes that help you to control your prejudice. Other things that work that people can do quite easily is try harder to notice when a woman's trying to speak. Notice if a woman's comment is being ignored and somebody else is being credited with her point. Say something about it, say, hey, that's what Julie was saying. Maybe adopt an affirmative action policy in chairing discussions. In philosophy, we have a kind of a problem where, I don't know if this happens in other fields, where at least in lots of departments, there'll be one or two very high prestige people who put their hands up at the start and say things like, I have 17 points I would like to make. And then nobody else gets to say anything. And the high prestige people tend to get called on preferentially. I prefer a policy of calling on people you haven't heard from before. And it gets different voices in. It doesn't amount to, you don't have to say I'm calling on the women. It'll get more women's voices in. It's just a matter of trying to hear from as many voices as possible. So think about policies like that you can adopt. Have a look at your letters of reference. See if you're saying things like, she's really good friends with my wife. See if you're doing subtler things than that. Perhaps swap letters with a friend and look at them for gendered content. Another thing to have a look at, I don't have time to go into it here, is implementation intentions. There's fantastic work that's been done in the psychology department here by Pascal Sheeran and Tom Webb. I urge you to have a look at it. Special way of formulating your intentions that makes them far more effective than they would otherwise be. Something that's very effective for stereotype threat is thinking about an alternative identity that you have that's not stigmatized. And this works because most of us have more than one identity. So I talked to you about the 5 to 7-year-old girls who underperformed on math tests when they were reminded of being girls. Well, East Asian girls in the US anyway are stereotyped as good at math because East Asians are in general in the US stereotyped as good at math. So if you have them color in a picture of a girl eating with chopsticks, which activates that part of their identity, the math performance goes way up. Okay. And this is something that you can tell your students about if they're suffering from stereotype threat. Any student here, whatever other social groups they're a member of, is a student at a Russell Group university. That is not a group that's stigmatized as doing poorly academically. And they can activate that identity. Bringing in people to talk about how they have succeeded despite suffering from various barriers related to their social group can help to diffuse stereotype threat. Talking about stereotype threat can help. Saying to your students at the start of a maths or physics class or a logic class, saying, you know, there's this thing, stereotype threat, and explaining how it works, and then saying, so anxiety that you're feeling might be due to this. That helps to reduce the anxiety and improve the performance. Another thing I can't quite figure out a way to make work in this country somehow is what they've done in America. They call it a values affirmation exercise, and I think all my students would run screaming from the room if I used that phrase here. But they had women in physics classes, actually women and men, but the effect was only shown for women, spend time in the physics class writing about values that are important to them. And the control group wrote about values that are important to other people, but not them. And the ones who wrote about values that are important to them for just a few minutes in that physics class did a full letter grade better. The women who did that is. Because thinking about the values that are important to you distracts your attention from the negative stereotypes about your group in a really valuable way. It helps you to affirm yourselves. Now, an important thing to notice about these techniques is it's not just the stuff that naturally leaps to mind to do. Some of it is quite counterintuitive and strange. We need to accept that we've got to seek expertise about how to deal with this stuff. Just reflecting and saying, yeah, I'll put a woman on the committee. That's not going to solve it. Our cognitive instruments are faulty in actually really fascinating ways. Right? But they are faulty and they need fixing, but we need experts to tell us how to fix them. And we need to get people to take this seriously and to find out about it. And I think that there are several things that are very important to do for this. One is to raise awareness that this is ubiquitous. This is a part of the human condition. This is just what we're like. Everybody's going to be subject to this stuff, and so we all need to think about how to do something about it. Importantly, this involves getting people to reject the common ways of thinking about racism or sexism, where we think, yeah, we know who the racists are, they're those people. Phew, I'm not one of them. Right? We need people to realize that this stuff affects all of us. That the people who are subject to racist and sexist biases aren't horrible Klan members. They're everybody. This is a part of being a human being. And I think it's vital to get people to see that this is not, being subject to these biases doesn't make you an evil human being, it makes you just a person. This is what people are like. Because if they think it makes them like the Klan, say, they're not going to accept that might be true of them. I think people are totally unaware of these biases and how they're affected by them. They can't possibly be blameworthy for that. It's contrary to their commitments. Even after becoming aware of these biases, most people don't know how to combat them. So when you're in that position of not knowing about the biases and not knowing how to control them, you're not to blame for it. And this point needs to be made over and over again. However, once you learn about it, and you learn some things you do become blameworthy if you don't do something about it. So I'm sorry about what I've done to all of you. You do become blameworthy if you don't do anything to change, but there are lots and lots of things that you can do to change things. And I think that we all need, both individually and collectively as a group, and when I say all of us, I don't just mean those of us in this room, I think all of our colleagues and everyone else as well, we need to fix our cognitive instruments. We need to do something about this stuff. So I'm going to close with a challenge that was posed to all the people who attended a conference last week that I went to on diversity in philosophy, which is that everyone in this room ideally should commit yourself to just one thing that you're going to regularly do to fight some of this stuff. And I'm going to suggest, because of the work on implementation intentions, that you formulate in a way somewhat like this. If a woman's point is being ignored, I will point it out. Or if I'm involved in hiring, I'll investigate ways to reduce bias. You don't have to say this. Just think it to yourself. And if you want to know more about why to formulate it exactly that way, you should look up the stuff on implementation intentions because it's very interesting. And I'll end there and pause for questions.
Yes, I don't want to sound at all negative after such a fabulously interesting and inspirational talk, but I just want to ask a question. My experience sometimes of having counter-stereotypical examples is that they're used in a way to sort of suppress your critique or initiative in raising the issue. So I think they can also be used in quite a negative way. Would you agree with that?
That's true. That's true. You have to be very careful how they're used. You don't want them. I mean, so the classic example right now is saying, obviously America has no racism problem because look at the president, right? And that needs to be fought. And I think it's easy to fight it because there's all this data showing the effects of these things. But you're absolutely right. You need to be sure that they're not held up in that way.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. My observation, and thank you to all the men in the room that have come to this event, is that this kind of talk or presentation appeals more to women. Now, one thing that perhaps you haven't covered is how to engage men in this kind of discussion or reflection, if you want, and if you have any suggestion.
In a way, I'm not the right person to ask. I think it might be the right people to ask would be the men in this room who came. But I mean, what I tried to do is to emphasize the way that one's own field is being harmed, so that even if you don't care about gender injustice, if good people are dropping out of the field, or having their work marked unfairly, or not getting the letters of reference they deserve, then that harms the field. So I try to make the point that way, that's a reason for everyone to care about it. I think most men in academia are committed to the thought that people should be treated fairly, and their work should be judged appropriately, and the best papers should be published, and the worst papers should be rejected, and showing that this stuff keeps that from happening, I found to be very effective. So I am on the editorial committee for the journal Analysis, which is one of the leading philosophy journals. And I spent about a decade trying to get Analysis to adopt anonymous refereeing. and anonymous editing, because they would reject like 90% of papers by the editor, failed completely till I wrote up one paragraph on implicit bias and sent it to every member of the editorial committee with a link to more stuff. And they just unanimously voted to go to triple anonymity, where the referees don't know the identity of the author and the editor doesn't know the identity. So after a decade of banging my head against the wall, this worked. So I think this stuff can be very effective.
Is there, thanks very much for that talk. Is there anything we can learn from countries perhaps where gender equality has been existed for longer about best practice, do you think?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't catch.
Sorry, no, it's just a question about can we learn anything about best practice from perhaps countries where gender equality may have existed for perhaps longer than in the UK?
Right, so, yeah, so can we learn anything from places like Scandinavia? Yeah. We probably can. I mean, a lot of what Scandinavia does right involves very different policies on maternity and paternity leave and childcare and that sort of thing, and a very strong social welfare state. They do still have problems with these issues. I was quite surprised to be invited to speak on women in philosophy in Sweden, because there was a group that was organizing on that, and I thought, well, this is Sweden. They'll probably be like 49% female and worried about it. And it turned out that they were down at 20%, just like everybody else. But it turned out that they were having more trouble getting this taken seriously by their university leadership, because the response was, well, but we're Sweden. You know, we've fixed all the gender problems. You know, this can't be. If it is, then it must be, you know, just something innate and unchangeable. So I think, I'm not sure that Scandinavia is that far ahead on this stuff.
Hi, I've got a question about pedagogy. What's your experience of introducing these ideas to your students, and how do they respond to being introduced to implicit bias?
Well, they're absolutely fascinated by it, and they all want to write papers about it. But there's some things that are very scary about it that you have to be careful to talk about. I mean, so I'm teaching this to third-year students who are applying for jobs. And they're really worried then about what's going to happen to them on the job market. And I can't really fix that, because in a part, you know, this is the way the world is, and I'm trying to fix it, but I can't fix it for them. Right? But in particular, when you talk about stereotype threat, you can give students things that they can do to fight stereotype threat. And I think it's vital that if you tell them about that, you also give them resources for combating it. And you tell them that we're trying to fix it so that the implicit bias doesn't harm them so much.
Thanks, Jenny. I really enjoyed that. I had a question about those intersecting overlaps between gender and... I always ask that question, between gender and ethnicity. So the black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins talks about colourblind racism and how that's taken over as a kind of form of discrimination, which has the same effects as kind of overt prejudice. And I was wondering if you might be able to say something about the ways that pretending that gender or race isn't an issue might actually kind of reify some of these problems.
Yeah, the people who think that they are ignoring, they're successfully not seeing race and not seeing gender actually display higher levels of bias than the people who think that that they're affected by it. So, you know, if somebody says, I don't see race, I don't see gender, you know they're a problem. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to make the point that we're not just fighting bias, we're fighting laziness, in the sense that a lot of the measures that one has to take involve additional effort.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other thing you asked about how the men in the room react. And so one thing is, I think, the importance of your blame-free approach is, I felt a lot of the time very uncomfortable as part of a group who's oppressing oppressing people. And so I'm inclined to hide.
Yeah.
So if you make it blame-free, then you're more it's easier.
I think that's right. And you're inclined to avoid this kind of topic and this kind of discussion because it makes you feel bad if it comes with the blame. But I think that's absolutely right. It's nice to have you say that because I have people who disagree with me about the blame point. But I think, practically speaking, it is much better to be blame-free. I also think blame's inappropriate until you know. I mean, if you learn all of this and then say, oh, yeah, I don't care, then I think you're blameworthy. But I think before that, you're not. But I think, to be fair to people, I don't think we're just fighting laziness. I think we're fighting the fact that we're all incredibly stressed and overworked. You know, so I say, go slowly, don't rush. But when I have 200 job applications and 2 weeks to review them while doing everything else, it's not possible. I'm going to be tired. I'm going to be rushed. I'm going to be stressed. I can make sure I'm not hungry, but the rest I can't do much about. You know? And I would like the applications to come to me anonymously, but the e-recruitment system doesn't do that. And getting them to change it's difficult.
Jenny, I was wondering, have you got any strategies you use yourself if you feel you're in a situation where the stereotypes threat? Maybe that's a hard question.
Okay.
Can you advise everybody else?
Well,
Think about it?
I have the strategies that I give people, and I have the data showing that they work. They don't work for everyone. So when I was first starting to work on this topic, I had written a paper or two on it. I'd done a lot of reading, and I knew about the stuff. I went to give a talk at a nameless university. Well, it's not actually nameless. And I was brought into a room very like this one, where the walls were covered with pictures of men, except it was a lot more. I mean, they were really covered. It was like hundreds of pictures of male philosophers. And all of them were male. As it turned out, there actually was a woman behind me, one woman, and I didn't see her. And there were absolutely no women in the audience. And eventually, like one or two came in late, but it was, And as I spoke, I found myself tripping over my words. And when people raised objections, I just couldn't remember what I wanted to say in response to them. And I was able to think to myself, this is stereotype threat. But I reacted, that helped me. It probably did help me. It didn't fix it, though. I still feel like I gave one of my worst performances because of this. And I'm, you would like to think that, as head of department, I think it was after I got that award, I feel pretty good about my career. I'm happy with it. I'm where I want to be. And I'm still subject to stereotype threat. So it doesn't go away, and it is hard to fight. And my performance was probably better than it would have been if I hadn't realized it was stereotype threat, because then I might have just thought, well, I'm really stupid. But it didn't fix it, I have to admit. I did then talk to the very nice people in the department about the pictures on their walls. They promised to do something about it. And they also acknowledged that it would be nice to have more than 2 women out of 50 in the room. And, and they were nice. They were really nice and seemed to genuinely care.
Jenny, I just wondered if there's been any work done, or whether you have any thoughts on the relationship between positive action initiatives, and dare I say the word quotas, and implicit bias, because on one hand that is a way of maybe overcoming implicit bias, but obviously it's the opposite to anonymization.
Okay, so implicit bias gives you a new argument for positive action, which I haven't drawn out explicitly, but it's there, which is that but the response to positive action is always, no, we want our hiring to be merit-based. But implicit bias gives you a reason to think your hiring is already not merit-based, right? And one way of making it more merit-based is to look a little harder at the female candidates, because of implicit bias, you're very likely overlooking their virtues. You're very likely not seeing them. So like when you're organizing a conference, the first names that leap to mind are going to be male names, because that's who your great philosopher image is in the case of philosophy. So it gives a new reason, in that implicit bias is making you take the women less seriously, and in that it'll improve things for everyone. So one of the things about standard arguments for affirmative action is they either turn on past injustice or on, providing a role model for members of the stereotype group. But implicit bias shows that introducing members of these stigmatized groups into the workplace doesn't just give useful role models for members of those groups, and it doesn't just rectify past injustice. It makes everybody in the workplace better thinkers. It makes them better at perceiving merit and better at making accurate judgments. Because the lack of diversity in the workplace is actually impeding their ability to think properly and to make accurate judgments. So it gives you new arguments for affirmative action. There's a question here.
How do you combat stereotypes in the wider world?
Well, I've been focused mostly on what to do in academia, but you try to do a lot of the same things in the wider world. You use this to argue for diversifying workplaces, for diversifying media, for diversifying everything that you see around you. That these are quite general arguments for achieving a more integrated world in all ways. How to get people to do that is a very difficult task.
Are there any more questions or comments?
Just when it comes to the wider world, and we had a question previously which related where you answered in Scandinavia, we would probably expect better examples, but has anyone actually looked what happened in the former Eastern Bloc countries? Because in Germany you have now the prime example, Angela Merkel. She is female physics professor and president or equivalent, what would be president. And she grew up in Eastern Germany. So is there any way we could learn from that, you think, or has anybody actually looked into that?
I am sure people have looked into it. I'm not an expert on that stuff. But the cross-cultural comparisons are always very, very complicated. So I think in the former Eastern Bloc countries, women tend to have been much more encouraged to go into things like the sciences. But there's also the issue that, my understanding is that there are very particular issues having to do with childcare in Germany because the school day often ends at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So any cross-cultural comparison, you've got to keep all these different balls in the air and keep track of them and notice all those things going on. So I think it's an immensely valuable thing to do, but I think it's really, really complicated.
Are there any more points or questions? I can smell food, which means if I have some, that means my implicit bias is going to be under control.
I'm glad you got my hint.
Can you all join me, please, and thank Jenny? That was a really interesting, fascinating talk.